Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We got another episode of the Movie Commentary Podcast coming at you. This is your host, Nick Everett, talking. And for the special occasion in which I'm releasing this, I'm currently recording this episode ahead of time. I'm hoping to release it. This should be around the time, the early parts of April. As all you well know, early April is what I like to refer to as Titanic month, because obviously Titanic sailed maiden voyage April 10th, 1912 to sank on April 15th, 1912. And for that occasion, I decided that I'm going to do another Titanic movie commentary. Now, this is not the 97 commentary that some of you, that a lot of you might think. This is actually another movie by 20th Century Fox. I think they were, the same company that helped distribute the 97 Titanic. And this is a movie made in 1953 that is also called Titanic. It stars Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck, Audrey Dalton, and a very, very young Robert Wagner. So, and let me see, without further ado, let me go ahead and start up the movie. Now, I will say, this is again, as a lot of you have, I just started the movie there, a lot of you remember one of my earliest podcasts, the Night to Remember podcast. I am actually a pretty big Titanic history buff. I've seen quite a few documentaries and movies on Titanic. This is one of the movies I haven't seen a whole lot. I have the Blu-ray. I'm watching this on the Blu-ray. I've seen this movie, I think, only twice, I believe. And, it doesn't have the extensive, history that, other films say the 97 Cameron Titanic has, or the 1958 film A Night to Remember has. But, it's still an interesting, it's still an interesting, look at, Titanic and, the look of the history and whatnot. Even though this movie, 1953 Titanic, is very much, it's very well known as being a very kind of loose historical interpretation of, of Titanic. There's a lot of stuff that's historically wrong with this movie. And it's, even said, like, a lot of historians kind of point out some of these, and, some of them are, really, they play them up for, they play them up for, what is it, like, for movie purposes and that kind of thing. One of the things that it's actually interesting here is they say that all the navigational details of this film, this is an opening title card here, conversations, incidents, and general data are taken verbatim from the published reports of the inquiries held in the 1912 by the Congress of the United States and then by the British Board of Trade also. So basically what they're saying is they're actually using the transcripts from the U.S. Inquiry into the sinking, as well as the British Lord Mercy inquiry as well. So, which actually did happen. When the Titanic sank back in 1912, both the British and the United States actually held their own inquiries into, basically, they would literally, what they would do during these inquiries is they literally would, put some of the, not to put them on trial, but it's like, say like, a Senate, it's like the Senate hearings you see on TV. They basically would ask questions. They would, bring people in, they brought in, J. Bruce Ismay, Frederick Fleet, the lookout that saw the iceberg, Charles Lightoller, most senior surviving officer, and they brought them in doing all of, to question them. So apparently from what this film says is that they used a lot of, of those, transcripts from the both the inquiries. And so now we're kind of getting some establishing shots of the Titanic kind of on its maiden voyage. As you can see, it's, a bustling of, activity, and there's a lot of moving parts around, and a lot of people going, a lot of people celebrating. You got the band, which, the band, they're showing a lot of brass players, like they're playing like, trumpets and, French horns, which I don't think the Titanic band actually had that. I think they were predominantly, I think they may have. I'm not well versed on the band. I can actually look this up. but from what I remember, they didn't have, brass instruments in their band. So now we're on the bridge, the Titanic's bridge, and actually this bridge right here that they're on, it's not really accurate of what the Titanic's bridge would look like. The one thing about this movie that is different, I would say from A Night to Remember or even like 97 Titanic is that, this one you don't see a whole lot of the locations are not perhaps, as, accurate as, as they would be. This bridge, is not, really the real bridge of the Titanic. I mean, I think it's more in line with actually like the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth or something like that. But, and, they even showed the grand staircase. I mean, and it looked, like a grand staircase, but it wasn't exactly, the Titanic grand staircase that, we've seen in pictures, even though there's no actual pictures of the Titanic grand staircase. Okay, so basically what I've been talking over, there's been a whole bunch of like mundane, stuff. The Captain E.J. Smith's been given a like I think like an old like, British Union Jack flag. From an old friend, something. I don't think that ever actually happened with Captain E.J. Smith, but just something that they're actually what this scene is actually portraying is the Titanic not starting at Southampton like the '97 Titanic or even the Night to Remember shows. They're actually showing the Titanic already started its maiden voyage and they've stopped at Cherbourg, France. And they're having the tender, I believe it's the tender Nomadic. A tender is basically a smaller ship that basically ferries passengers, to the Titanic. And they're basically just showcasing this, idea, that they're, the passengers are getting tendered out to the ship now. And we're getting introduced to one of the main characters, looks like a middle-aged woman named Julia, played by Barbara Stanwyck, and we don't know it yet. But basically, the story again because this is not as well known of a Titanic movie as, say, A Night to Remember or even in the '97 version. But this Titanic, basically the story, the plot line is that there is basically a family, a mom with with her two children, and they're of the British kind of upper crust, the British elite, so to speak. And their mom, who's actually an American, is kind of grown, tired of that, British lifestyle. She kind of wants to bring them back to America to have them grow up in a, much, have them, not in the British, upper crust, so to speak, or something like that. So that's essentially the main plot line. And we've met on this tender here. We've met the mom and the two and the son and the daughter. The son, I don't know what the son's played by. He's a kind of a younger actor in the film here, played by Harper Carter. And then the daughter, Annette, is actually played by Audrey Dalton. It was actually kind of funny is that with this movie, and it's a bit of a short read when you're reading about like how the film was developed. Basically, what it basically says is that one of the producers of the film called up Daryl Zanuck, and he basically says like, "Hey, we have this actor Clifton Webb under contract. We have CinemaScope. We want to do something big, and we just need to use like all these young people that we have." So they basically, they use something big, and then they pitch this idea of the Titanic. So it wasn't like they were out to essentially. They weren't out to, make a movie about the Titanic, or they weren't out to basically, they weren't out to do some like historical drama. No, they literally like, hey, we have this actor, let's put him in something really big. Let's make this like big epic scale movie. So they made Titanic. So this now, so we're coming back to the movie here. This is interesting. We're meeting the dad, man by the name of Richard Sturges, who is played by Clifton Webb, the main actor, and what he's trying to do here now is he's trying to get himself a ticket on to Titanic, and he's actually it's actually funny. He's actually bribing a steerage family for their tickets, and I'm trying to read here. So they buy. So he basically buys like steerage tickets, and again, steerage is third class. That's the lowest class you could have had on Titanic. He's buying the lowest class tickets, on Titanic. He's basically buying them from this family so that he can get on Titanic, and then so he can get his family and all that kind of stuff. Now, again, what's interesting about this is that he's buying himself a third class ticket, and his family's in the first class. And this movie, as we kind of see, the movie kind of showcases him, moving interchangeably between third and first class, which I think is, it was more well shown in the '97 Titanic that, when Jack tried to, go see Rose. I mean, the movement of third to first class was not as, easy as they show it here. I mean, they show oh gosh, who is it? They show, Richard Sturges kind of moving, in and out of, third class to first class with his family, which, wouldn't have happened. So, and again, another interesting tidbit that I missed on that was that, the reason that Richard Sturges had to buy that ticket from this third class family was that he goes up to the bookkeep to buy tickets from, and they essentially say, oh, yeah, no, the Titanic's all sold out, which is actually a historical inaccuracy. The Titanic is, when the Titanic set sail, I believe the Titanic was less than half booked, actually, with passengers. I believe it could have held at least 1,000 more passengers. And obviously, looking back on it was a lot, better that it didn't, carry more passengers. I think the reasons that, it wasn't as well known of a maiden voyage is, I think at the time Titanic was maybe not as, big news as, what some people make it out to be nowadays. Because, remember, the Titanic was the second in line of Olympic class ships. You had the Olympic that came by, and, the Olympic was really big news. I mean, the Olympic was really big news, and everybody was really excited about the Olympic. But then Titanic came along, and it was like, well, I mean, it's not that it was like, it wasn't well covered. It's just I feel like a lot of people was like, well, been there, done that with Olympic, because essentially, if you look at them, they're the same types of ships. And then also, I think when looking at, I think also at the time there was a coal strike. It was a well-documented coal strike of coal miners, and there wasn't enough coal, so that was kind of dissuading a lot of people from actually traveling on the tramp steamer and the steamships back in those days. So again, the whole idea that that it was booked up was kind of a fallacy. So we're starting I think they finally have raised anchor at Cherbourg, and I think they're finally starting off now. It's not really telling us what's going on. We're seeing we're seeing rooms we're seeing the boilers. We're seeing the coal miner, the coal stokers, and the firemen, wheeling the coal in and all that kind of stuff. And we see Captain E.J. Smith here, played by, I believe, Brian Airn. I can't really say that name. Who's actually an English actor. Again, I wouldn't say the best Captain Smith, impression performance that I've seen from this actor, because, again, I think it was Bernard Smith, um, who was in the '97 Titanic, did a wonderful job, and then even the actor, God, Lawrence, I think Naismith, or it's the guy in the '90 in A Night to Remember. Yep, Lawrence Naismith. Yep, played Captain AJ Smith in A Night to Remember. So, and again, not the best performance, but it's still a solid performance. Now we actually had this again, what I was talking about, this whole idea that steerage passengers couldn't interact with first class passengers. So Richard here, so he basically gets on as a steerage passenger, and essentially, what he goes up, he starts in third class and then he goes up to first class, and then there's a guy, I don't know if he was a crew member or not, there was a guy that's like, oh, you don't belong up here, and I don't know what Richard, he handed him something what looked like either big and kind of expensive, so I think he probably bought his way into like first class or something like that, but it was, again, it's well known that third class passengers were not allowed. If you were a third class passenger holding a third class ticket, you weren't going up into first class. And it's not like in the '97 Titanic, that they would even invite you up there. If you were a first class passenger, you were not really gonna go there. So now we're meeting an interesting character. So we've met. So we've met a guy that appears to be a college age student in and he kind of was flirting a little bit with Audrey Dalton's character, basically the daughter of the father son main character couple. But and one of the people that we meet is actually, and I'm reading the oh geez, who is it here? I'm reading the plot line here. We met a 20-year-old Purdue University tennis player named Gifford Rogers, who is played by a very young Robert Wagner. Apparently, he was one of the young actors employed by Universal Studios at the time. And so we met Robert Wagner's character, was it Giff Rogers, I believe it is. And basically at first it's kind of that whole, he's hitting on like Audrey Dalton's character, the Annette, the daughter of the kind of the oldest daughter of the couple. And then at first it's like she rebuffs his advances and that kind of thing, and he kind of keeps going at it as the movie goes on, that kind of thing. So, and of course Robert Wagner, those who don't know, he's well known. He's been in a well-known actor. He's been in the movie. He was in the television show Heart to Heart, It Takes a Thief, Switch. Apparently had a role in Two and a Half Men back in the day. The Towering Inferno, the Pink Panther, Airport 97, some of the Austin Powers movies. Also well known for being the husband to Natalie Wood, and also being around her at the time, being suspicious in Natalie Wood's death. So again, I don't want to get too much into that, but yeah, Robert Wagner, again, a pretty well-known actor. I'd say probably one of the more well-known actors to come out of this movie. And so now basically we're starting to see kind of the we're seeing basically what's the main kind of motivations of the characters. We're kind of seeing they're basically, the mom is the mother of the family is basically telling them like, hey, we're Americans, we belong in America. Richard, the father is trying to tell him like, hey, we're like upper crust elite, we're wealthy, we're wealthy in Europe, we can stay wealthy in Europe. and they're actually, I think, technically taking them back to Michigan in order to rear them as down-to-earth Americans, rather than rootless elitists like Richard himself. So that's what the plot is. I've read that straight from the plot on Wikipedia. So again, a bit of another Titanic, movie that kind of deals in terms of a semi love story ish, not really, but kind of, But I mean, kind of similarities between '97 Titanic and this one, but yeah, it's. I will admit, I mean, I wouldn't say it's the even as a movie, not well written, even back in 1953. Even though this movie did win the Academy Award for, I think, Best Original Screenplay, which I don't know. Of course, it was the 50s, but who knows? So it's actually kind of interesting, They've been sitting in the first class saloon. They were sitting in the first class, dining saloon, and what you notice is that it's actually not anywhere close to the actual Titanic dining room that you see either in A Night to Remember or in the '97 Titanic. The interesting thing about this movie is that a lot of the rooms are too tall per se. I mean, the dining room it had a ceiling that extended way, way up, and in reality, the Titanic dining saloon really was only about a deck high. I mean, it really was not that big. I mean, the dining saloon was the biggest single room on the Titanic, but it wasn't high. It was only just about a deck high. It was only about a deck high. So, but still a really awesome room. But just again, another historical inaccuracy is just the portrayal of the dining room here. So. No, the Marconi guys. I've already talked a lot about the Marconi guys in the last A Night to Remember film, but again, basically they're kind of portraying Jonathan Phillips, the senior wireless operator, and Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator. Which of course they don't really specify whom is who here. Let me see if they even. Yeah, they don't even have they don't even have a cast person here. They don't even have them distinguished by cast members. So, and they're showing, and what they're showing here is they're actually showing they're showing a gentleman writing down a message for the wireless guys to actually transmit to the mainland, essentially, which is actually which happened a lot actually on Titanic, the original Titanic. In fact, actually, it was really the main job of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. It was they took messages from passengers, in most cases first class wealthy passengers, and they would wireless, and they would transmit them to the mainland, because there was I believe the wireless station in Cape Race in Newfoundland, which they would tap it into them, and then they would probably relay it to some other station. So that's basically what we've been showing here, and I believe we just met the character that was asking for it. I think he comes into be a bit of a guy. Oh, it's George S. Healy. It's basically a Catholic priest who's been apparently, and I quote unquote, defrocked, which essentially basically means he's been removed from being a priest, removed from the clergy. And they basically showed him kind of in a drunken stupor trying to give the message to the wireless guys, and they didn't really understand his message. So, and then we meet another character here. We meet a first-class passenger named Maud Young. And, as you can see, she's kind of, portrayed as a bit of a blunt, character, blunt American, kind of character on the Titanic. Obviously, kind of a historical representation, a historical representation of fictional representation of, you know, Molly Brown and all that, and the real life, unsinkable Molly Brown from Titanic, Margaret Brown. Of course, there is no true Maud Young. It's just kind of a fictional representation of a character. So, but you can obviously tell. I mean, you can tell it's especially if you know your Titanic history. First class lady that is kind of blunt with how she talks. That's really Molly Brown. So it was really funny what they were doing here, and I don't know if that happened on the real Titanic, but apparently what they were doing was there was a guy, he had like a chest of, he actually had he had basically a chest of like numbers, and apparently he's like, yeah, if it corresponds to the minute that we drop anchor, then yeah, you win money or something like that. Of course, I'm pretty sure. I think there was some kind of gambling going on Titanic. Obviously, card games with really expensive really expensive, really, rich people. I'm pretty sure there was a little bit of gambling going on, but I don't know if it was extensive. They may have, shown it here, or there was actually like explicit gambling, but who knows? So basically, Giff here, the guy played by Robert Wagner. He's the tennis player from Purdue, and he is essentially explaining to Barbara Stanwyck's character, I believe her name is Julia. Yep, Julia is essentially basically like, hey, I'm Purdue college player. I'm a college player. He's basically trying to tell his life story. It's one of those things. I think he's trying. He knows that she's the mom of that daughter that he caught the eye of, and he's trying to impress her. So something like that. And she's also apparently reading him something. Giff's actually a really cool character in this movie. He's one of the. He's a character that I actually really, really enjoy. You kind of get to know him really well, and as he does, kind of fall for, Annette, the older daughter of the couple there. So again, I mean, they're just, on Titanic, they're doing their thing, first class passengers, on the top decks, like they would be. A whole lot really to talk about here. I'm kind of grasping for straws. Not really. But I'm trying to. But as you can tell, basically Richard kind of met Annette, Julia on the top deck on the boat deck, and essentially there was some obviously strain in the relationships and that kind of thing. And again, going back to the whole, I'm going back to the height of the rooms that I mentioned in with the dining saloon. The height of this first class stateroom that they're in, again, is pretty high. I mean, you don't really see the roof of it, but I mean, again, the rooms were not really tall. I mean, they were tall enough, for most, if not almost every person to talk, to be in. But I believe what they're saying here is that, and what was that? There was actually a thing on here. There was a thing. I think what they said was that the rooms that are showcased here are actually quote unquote double height, or so to speak. They're basically the height, I think, of like two decks or something like that. But of course, in the original Titanic, I believe all of the rooms were literally just one deck high. I mean, if you had a room on C deck, that room was essentially only on C deck. It didn't extend down to E deck, or basically C deck had their just rooms, and then E deck, B deck, C deck, D deck, E deck, G deck, orlop deck, and then tank bottom. So, and none of the rooms extended to the decks above. So. So again, some mundane kind of family stuff that's happening with, some mundane family stuff here. I believe one of the things I wanted to say here. So let me see. There's a quote here. So one of the things I actually read, and I read this. This is the IMDb trivia of this movie. Apparently, it's to ensure authenticity. The producers recruited a former captain of the Queen Elizabeth as a technical consultant. And what's actually interesting, and something that you actually hear, as you hear now, and you don't hear it now, and then you kind of hear it later. No background music is in this film. The only music that you hear is actually from the actual band aboard, the musicians aboard the ship. So it's actually something kind of interesting. And again, it was interesting is that, it's something because I've seen this movie a couple times, not a whole lot, but it's not something that I hadn't noticed until now, honestly. So. It's interesting here, actually. It's a bit of the family drama. So basically, in the film here, because the mom. And I think, the mom here again, as I'd say, the mother, Julia, is trying to, take her kids back into Michigan. Basically to have, they're going to be, down to earth, quote unquote, American, lifestyle. And, the daughter, Annette, played by Audrey Dalton, has realized that, that's what the mom's going to do. And she's grown used to the very lavish lifestyle that they apparently, I believe what she said is they live in Paris, France. And, and they obviously were, and and Audrey, sorry, I lose a bit of train of thought there. Audrey, she Annette actually said to her father, hey, whenever you go back to Europe, I'm gonna go with you. So she's obviously been grown used to her lifestyle in Europe. So now that we're back on the bridge, and you see the captain on the bridge, the quartermaster at the wheel. See the captain. I believe what he's looking at are the ice messages posted on the bulletin board there. I can't be for sure. And again, one of the things I think that they said was that the lookouts are, looking for. I believe what they were saying is the lookouts are on the lookout for ice and all that kind of stuff. And that was one of the things that was relayed to them is look out for small ice and growlers, and that was honestly a direct quote from the inquiries. Trying to look here. I would admit though, there's a. It's really, well, I find it kind of fun. It's the funny 1950s film writing, and there's this, and it's the son of the family. His name is Norman, and he's a 10-year-old boy, and he basically saying, hey, we're dining at the captain's table tonight, and and then basically it's well, that's just it, sir. I feel out of place, and oh my goodness, and it was oh my gosh, he just his like he just talks like he's just it's like that just really like weird 50 style of acting. So um it's so it was just really funny watching it because he was like talking about I think it was that whole thing like how like kids back in those days like they would wear like those like knickerbockers I think which were like the like pants with like the that like kind of can I think they're like modern day like they were like the capris back and they would look like capris but like they were like pants for like I think like little boys and then as you grow older you actually get to wear like longer trousers. I think that's like the like the old urban legend or something like that. um but and one thing that I'm interested in, and this is actually a question it's a question I'm going to answer myself right now. Titanic, apparently they were showing that they had a tailor on board, and I'm wondering if the Titanic actually had a tailor on board because they were actually showing Richard, the father, going to get his tuxedo, kind of like tailored and get fitted for one and that kind of thing. And I've never know if there was actually a tailor on board the Titanic. Let me actually read this. Actually, is there any actual movie about that? I'm answering this right. I'm trying to answer this right now. So apparently, one of the things that says, yeah, and it's kind of like an encyclopedia Titanica a forum release is that the Titanic had a complete tailor shop for getting long pants, which is actually one of the errors in the 53 movie. So apparently, Titanic did not have a tailor on board, and that's interesting. So again, you learn something new every day about it. So we're having ourselves another interesting moment in the film here. So we've already had the establishing event that the daughter Annette is gonna go back with the father, Richard, go back when they go back to Europe, and the mother is basically saying like, hey, I mean, she can do whatever she wants, but I want to keep my son Norman with me, and Richard apparently gets extremely upset about it, and he's pretty upset about it because he's pretty upset because he's like he's not my son and blah. He's trying to say like he's my son. I'm not going to give him up. And apparently Julia, his wife, essentially says, "Oh yeah, Norman, yeah, he's not your son." And you can see it kind of leaves Richard pretty pretty shell shocked to be quite honest with you. So, and what they actually say later is that Norman is essentially he wasn't Richard's son, but essentially a um the oh gosh, what is it? Let me see here. Result of a one night stand after a bitter argument. So yeah, and again, it's a bit of a shell shock to Richard, and he kind of takes it hard, and it affects kind of his relationship with his son, kind of for the rest of the film. Something I'm not a big fan of, but again, it's kind of part of the movie. Again, even with this movie, it's not that I'm a huge fan of it. Even like, I mean, I like the other Titanic movies better, but it's still a good movie. It's still a good, interesting movie to look at, so to speak. No, it's this is interesting. So there's what I'm trying to say here. There's like a third class woman I think looking for Richard Sturgis, I believe. One of the things that they just showed here on this things that they showed was that they actually showcase the like passengers like dancing, and apparently there was like a dance floor for to start dancing and all that kind of stuff. The Titanic actually didn't really have didn't really have a dance floor, really didn't have ballroom dancing, so to speak. That's one of the things that you see a lot of the 50s movies, especially like the 43 German movie about the Titanic and then this movie about Titanic, is that there's, apparently they had like ballroom dancing and all that kind of stuff, and that's not really the case. I mean, it's kind of fun to look at, but, it didn't really happen, so. And again, it's kind of a bit of an awkward dance because you see that Audrey Dalton and you see like Audrey Dalton and Robert Wagner. They're like dancing together, and it's kind of weird, but also kind of funny too. What was I trying to see here? I'm trying to think. Like, there's a steerage woman, I believe, that's talking with Richard Sturges. I don't know. Class wealthy woman of origin, Thelma Ritter, social climber, Earl Meeker, Velma. I don't know if that actually has anything to do with the actual film or something like that, but it's still kind of interesting. I think the one thing that I would say even about this movie, compared to the other Titanic movies, is that there's like, at least for me, I like the movies that actually explore the historical side of Titanic, because again, that's one of my big reasons of like I like watching this. But they're also the reason that I really like, the '97 Titanic as well, is that the fictional story is actually quite compelling to me as well. I know there are a lot of people in the '97 movie that kind of poo-poo the romance and kind of think of the writing as cheesy, and looking back on it, maybe it is. I mean, but I really like it. I mean, I'm a sucker for it, so to speak. And then the thing with this movie, like, you just don't find yourself getting super immersed into the fictional story, and maybe that's because it's also a 70 or it's a nearly 70-year-old movie, produced at a time, produced at a time, back I think when like studios were like literally like they would pump out movies like literally just because they had an actor and they wanted to fulfill a contract, but you just don't find yourself being drawn to the movie, so to speak, than like like the '97 Titanic. It doesn't give you the reason I like the '97 Titanic is that it really gives you like fictional characters to really latch onto, really identify with, And with this movie, I feel like it's trying with these, fictional characters, Richard and Annette and Julia Sturges, but you just don't feel it, honestly. But there you go. But it's actually kind of funny here. Is you get Richard. He's really acting like all uptight now because he just found out that his son Norman is not really his son, and that she explained that it was a one night stand, and you see kind of that he's basically giving like disowning his son and basically giving him up because he realizes this now. So, but I don't know. It's just still a weird, like storyline, fictional storyline, so to speak. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, he's just really upset about the whole thing, and what's actually you actually kind of see like the interactions with him and his son kind of later in the film, and essentially, because his son and him had been, Richard and Norman had been playing like shuffleboard matches and on Titanic, which I believe I don't remember if Titanic actually did have shuffleboard on board. I'm pretty sure they did, but I'm not really sure if I don't know if they did or not. Again, that's another thing kind of left up to interpretation. But they were really wanting to play like shuffleboard together, and you kind of see later in the film that he kind of poo-poos his son, and it's really just he just kind of doesn't even talk with him, kind of brushes him off. So, and now you get to meet the stewards and the stewardesses, and this room here, I don't know, and they say the promenade deck, but just I don't think this is the actual promenade deck. I mean, there was an enclosed. I mean, maybe it was like it looks like the first class smoking room that they're in, which is really odd historically because they also showcase women in the first class smoking room. Now, you also got to remember the times. 1912, there weren't instances like a lot of the times. Women and men. The smoking room on Titanic was a predominantly men oriented room. I mean, it wasn't it wasn't a written rule that women were not allowed in the smoking room. It was just kind of like a social rule, that kind of thing. And what's interesting is that it shows Richard going into the first class smoking room, or what looks like the smoking room, and basically starting to play cards in there, which is what would happen a lot in that room. I mean, guys would smoke, drink brandy, play cards in that room. But the one thing that's inaccurate is that you wouldn't have seen women in the room now, in the smoking room. Now, I believe there was a room called the first class reading room that, a lot of women would go into. And, it was, I believe it was the reading room. It's been a while since I've done the Titanic stuff, but but going back to the women, just it's something just interesting that I noticed in this, that you just wouldn't see women in the smoking room. It just wouldn't have happened. Now we're going back to that drunken priest that is traveling back on Titanic. And apparently, Barbara Stanwyck, Julia's character, she's meeting up with him and she's helping him up from the ground. And apparently, he can't even. He needs the railing to stand and all that kind of stuff. So it's. I don't really know what his purpose, the drunken priest's purpose is, even in this film. I mean, honestly, he's just kind of there. So it doesn't really seem like he plays any part there. So. Oh my gosh. There actually were, priests on board the Titanic. I mean, there was a famous priest, Father Thomas Biles, who, was, he was, he passed away on the Titanic from, drinking, he passed away, and he was, seen, he was seen on the bridge, giving last rites to people, and he ended up surviving. He ended up dying himself. So yeah, there were priests on Titanic. Now, were there drunk priests, or were there like disgraced priests on Titanic? I don't think I've never heard of a story of that actually happening on the Titanic. Now, I would admit this also, I feel like this is a bit of a mix of also the chief baker, Charles Jugan, and again, I kind of mentioned his story in the Night to Remember podcast, because the baker, Charles Jugan, is actually showcased quite predominantly in that film, but Charles Jugan was a chief baker on Titanic that actually during the sinking had actually been, drinking during the sinking, like quite literally in the middle of when the ship was sinking, he would continually go down to his room, pour himself like a bottle, like a glass of scotch or brandy, um, and then what was it? And then he'd go back up and maybe throw a couple deck chairs onto the ship and all that into the water, but and then he actually, like Jack and Rose did in the '97 movie, he actually rowed the bow of the ship down into the water, and he actually treaded in the water for like 2 hours. He was the longest. He was the guy that lasted the longest in that freezing cold water whenever it happened. So it was interesting, and so that's what I get from this drunk priest Reverend George Healy character. I don't think there were actual priests, Catholic priests, bishops, fathers, whatever you call them, on Titanic. And again, were any of them actually disgraced? Yeah, I don't think so. I don't really think. I've never heard of a story about that. I'm pretty sure that actually would have. I'm pretty sure that would have been a well-known story of the story of the drunken priest on Titanic, but I don't think we've heard of that yet. So. Another, I believe, historical inaccuracy here. I don't believe that there were actually they're using a typewriter, and it's kind of showcasing one of the ice warnings from the Marconi guys. You never have seen a typewriter. I've never seen a typewriter in other movies of the Titanic. So I don't know if the Marconi guys actually had, a typewriter in the film. Again, it might be another thing that, yeah. Again, I don't think that there was a typewriter on the Titanic, or in the Marconi room on the Titanic, but it's just something interesting, though. No, this is interesting. I kind of forgot about this part. So so they're actually showcasing what looks like a Christian service, and this actually did happen. The Christian service actually happened on that Sunday, April 14th, the day that the Titanic hit the iceberg, and it was a non-denominational service presided over by Captain E.J. Smith, which they showcase here. I believe it was held in the first class dining room. However, obviously the dining room we're taking obviously liberties taken with the layout of the dining room and how it looks and all that kind of stuff. And I believe they finish with the "For Those in Peril on the Sea" hymn, which is actually what ended up happening. What's that? Let me see. "For Those in Peril on the Sea." "Eternal Father, strong to save." That's the hymn that was sung the morning that Titanic sank, and that was and it is a song that is associated with maritime people and seafaring disasters, because it does end with the line "For those in peril on the sea," and that hymn was sung. And again, I say that again. It was sung literally Sunday morning at, a little before 11:10, whenever that was held, o'clock ship's time, whenever the Christian service was held, and then quite literally 12 hours later, 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the Titanic hits the iceberg. So it's unfortunately it's another one of those kind of eerie happenings that happens in the story in the so-called foreshadowing of the Titanic. So yeah. I think they're playing this. Oh yeah, it's this bridge game here that they keep playing. I believe they're playing. So George here, he's he's playing the game with Maud Young, and I believe another guy is that he's playing Maud Young. Is the George? I believe Maud Young. He's playing bridge with Maud Young, and then I believe another. The other person that he's playing with is actually George Widener, who is actually portrayed to be George Widener, and they actually call them by name, George Widener, and there it is, this Titanic guy, and George Widener was an actual. And George Widener was an actual businessman from Philadelphia who actually died on the Titanic. One of the one of the more wealthier people to die on Titanic. Body was never recovered. Believe his wife survived. His son Harry perished. So yeah, again another sad story. On the people dying on Titanic. Of course, it's actually funny because you don't see a whole lot of like actual historical characters in this movie. You see Maud Young, who's a fictional representation of a character, of a real life character, and then George Widener, which actually was really surprising because a lot of times when you think of the historical people, actual people that were on Titanic, you think of John Jacob Astor, you think of his wife Madeline, the two richest people on the ship. You think of, Isadora and Ida Strauss, the owner of the Macy's, department store. Yes, that Macy's department store, who both perished together, because Ida wouldn't leave her husband. You think of Benjamin Guggenheim. You think of Lorraine Allison, the Allison family, who all perished in first class, and except for the little baby Trevor. You think of the crew, but you don't think of George Widener. It's kind of an odd choice, to be quite honest with you. Now, again, he's a famous, very wealthy, famous person that did pass away on the Titanic. But again, it was to me a bit of an odd choice, to be quite honest with you. So. That's a weird. That's a weird scene here. You got you see this weird scene in which oh gosh, what is it? Robert Wagner's character Giff is starting to show Audrey Dalton's character to dance. It's actually funny. My mom has a big celebrity crush on Robert Wagner. My mom's a big fan of the series Heart to Heart. So, and I even told her before I recorded this that that Robert Wagner was in this movie, and she's like, "Oh my gosh!" But and you can see that Audrey Dalton's character is starting to, kind of grow a fancy to Giff. So even though they had like one dance together, so that was kind of, funny. Yeah, the relationships are not. I don't believe the relationships are well thought out in this movie, to be quite honest with you. But again, that's just me. So, because it's really funny, they had like one dance together, and now she seems like, oh my gosh, I really like this guy. So, yeah, that's just the wonderful, you know, idea of comparing movies comparing movies from the 50s back into today's world. Like, my gosh, I can't talk. Oh, interesting line there. So one of the things that they just did was that they had a person. They had I believe, I don't know if there was like a stewardess or like a steward, or one of the crew members actually had a bugle, and every time that it was actually time for dinner, they would they would call time for dinner, one of the crew members would actually take a bugle and kind of sound off like, like I don't know exactly what he would play, but it essentially would be announcing dinner, for all those to see, for all those to hear. And what what Richard Sturges here said was that, it's like, why did the British have to announce, dinner like it's a cavalry charge? And that actually, to me, mirrors a line that Molly Brown said in the '97 movie. She's like, why do they have to like announce it like, like we're, like we're like cattle going to the slaughterhouse, or why do they have to ring it like like we're, like we're chattel? Like, it was a funny line. It's something I saw that was pretty interesting. Let me see here. What's going on here? So we're, she's trying to reason now. Julia's met up with Richard. She's going up to Richard and begging with him to, um, she's trying to, like, because he kind of brushed off, he brushed off, his son Norman earlier in the night, and she's trying to, get like, please, reconsider and that kind of thing, and yet he's still not gonna do that. So now I will admit, like, all these things that I've been mentioning about Richard, as the character, as it's been going on, all the stuff that I've been mentioning, there's actually going to come up. There's something going to happen after the ship hits the iceberg, and and it's going to be a bit of a complaint again. I've heard you kind of heard me a bit of complaints about this movie again, because it's not the best made Titanic film out there. Because again, I think it's literally just made it was made to make a movie. It wasn't made to service the Titanic or the Titanic's history. So again, for me, not the most well made Titanic movie, but again, it's still interesting to talk about. But now they're talking to now. There was I believe it was Second Officer Lightaller, and it was they were talking about. He was talking to the Marconi guys. He was talking to the wireless guys about, hey, these ice messages, which ones were sent to the bridge, or which ones were, and they were telling us like, hey, these were sent to the bridge and all that kind of stuff. And of course that's become, well known in the history of, the Titanic, that not all the ice warnings, were relayed to, the bridge, that should have been relayed. And here what Captain Smith Captain Smith here is what he's doing is he's taking an ice warning, and they're basically in the chart room, I believe, with Chief Officer Wild, and what they're doing is that they're basically charting where they're going to meet the ice. Now, in reality, what actually happened, they did, get ice warnings, so they knew the general area of where the ice was going to be, which was accurate, I believe, in most part. And it's actually interesting because they say that Smith didn't alter the course. He's saying that Smith didn't alter the course, but he actually somewhat did alter the course of the voyage. I mean, they did, because what they did was they actually took a more southern route. Because what they were doing, they basically had like kind of a straight shot, kind of up in the northern Atlantic, and what they tried to do was steer a little bit south so they could potentially go under the ice. Because what they saw is what they were thinking is the more northern you went, the more ice you were going to see. But it went away. But what they did was they steered south, and they were hoping that we're going to go south enough in order to miss the iceberg. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was that that the ice field actually drifted farther, south than what ended up happening. So technically, what they showed here with the captain not making any course corrections. Of course, they didn't show anything earlier in the film, but technically that's not true. He did make course corrections in regarding to the ice. So I mean, there is that myth that he basically didn't do anything. Captain Smith didn't do anything regarding the ice messages. That's not all true. I mean, he I believe that Captain Smith acted back in 1912. He acted, according to what he knew how to run, according to what his knowledge was of running a ship back in 1912, he did what he thought was right. And at the time, and for a long time, it was right. You didn't really worry too much about ice messages. I mean, you try to steer further south. A lot of ships weren't even getting ice messages, because there weren't, not every ship at this time had, wireless capabilities like the Titanic had. And so you get a lot of people that, stated that, Captain Smith's, he was negligent, he was this, in the ship. And looking back, yes, he was a negligent, but it wasn't because he was negligent, because he wasn't doing his job. No, he was doing his job, and what they realized is that the protocols that we have in place now are, in fact, negligent protocols. We need to update our protocols on how we handle icebergs and all that kind of stuff. So that was something. Something I kind of went off on a tangent with Captain Smith, because he gets a bit of a bad rap in the sinking of the Titanic, and he does play a big role in the loss of life, in the ship, in the disaster actually happening. I mean, he plays a big role in it, and there's no denying that. But you also got to remember the extent of what happened, the circumstances of the time, and it wasn't like that. And the protocols that were in place were followed, but you can see that they didn't go very far. They didn't end very well. There's actually kind of an interesting scene here. They're showing the captain overseeing they're seeing the captain. Basically, he's in like this room, which I don't know if this room that I can't even explain because it didn't really even exist on Titanic. But there's a giant piano and GIF and all like the college age people on the ship are singing and GIFs kissing Annette here, and which of course that relationship moved pretty fast, but you saw the captain kind of overseeing it, and this is taking place on the night that the ship hit the iceberg and ultimately sank. That wasn't actually. It's actually kind of a historical inaccuracy there, because the Titanic, because Captain Smith actually he didn't go wander around the ship. He actually went back to bed, and he was laying in bed at the time that the ship hit the iceberg. And he felt the ship hit the iceberg, and that's what awoke him from that's what he woke up from. So, and now they just showed the clock there that it's getting closer to 11:40. That there is an iceberg. That we are getting indeed closer to the ship hitting the iceberg. And so now we finally see the ship, the iceberg in the distance. We see the lookouts hit. They see the lookouts ring the bell 3 times. They say iceberg right ahead, and they say hard to starboard and all that kind of stuff. In fact, they actually showed hard to starboard, and again all things that were kind of taken. All things back in the all things that are kind of thought to of what has actually happened when Titanic hit the iceberg. They hard to starboard, which actually meant what hard to starboard, but instead of actually turning it to the right, they turn it to the left. But what's actually interesting, and actually one thing I wanted to notice that is that the there's a couple things wrong with how the ship hits the iceberg here. Um, the ship, the iceberg is well too tall for the ship. I mean, they say that they showcase the iceberg that's hitting the Titanic here as being well like feet in like hundreds and hundreds of feet in the air and well above the smokestacks, when in reality the Titanic, the iceberg, barely even reached the boat deck. I mean, the iceberg was tall, but it wasn't like, a towering block of ice above the Titanic. I mean, it was tall. And also what you just saw here was that um, the iceberg hit the Titanic um, on the Titanic's port side, but in reality, it actually hit the Titanic on the starboard side. Of course, it was actually a bit also a movie mistake, because they showed the Titanic trying to turn around the iceberg, turning to the left. It turned to port, even though they said hard to starboard. Those were the tiller orders. The tiller orders back in 1912 basically said hard to starboard means turn to the left, because they were using the tiller orders. They turned to the left, and because they turned to the left, the iceberg hit on the starboard side of the Titanic. However, in the movie, and it showed that in the movie here. However, what they actually showed the iceberg causing the gash underwater, and then when they were showing it underwater, they were showing the iceberg hitting the Titanic on the port side. So that was a bit of a movie mistake there. I mean, I don't think they were intentionally trying to make that mistake. It was just, I believe, a movie mistake there. But again, a historical inaccuracy. So. And what they showcased was that the iceberg actually, what they said was that the iceberg actually ripped a giant gash into the side of the ship, which it probably didn't happen. What actually more than likely happened, we never really will know what happened to the iceberg damage, on the Titanic, because at the wreck now, the iceberg damage is in the mud. It's below the mud line, and what they showcased was that but what they say more than likely happened was that when the iceberg hit the side of the ship, because the Titanic, the hull was had like multiple steel plates that were held in by rivets, and what happened was that when the iceberg hit those steel plates, the plates buckled, and they opened up the plates. And that ultimately caused the water to start rushing in. So, so that's ultimately what ended up happening. That's what they think happened. There's been a lot of controversy about what actually happened with the iceberg damage, and whether or not the steel used on the ship was, good quality steel or good quality rivets. I mean, that's been a controversy since the ship even sank, but it's been, nothing, but it's still an interesting controversy. But I think the steel and the rivets used were well enough, but it's just, you get a giant iceberg like that, hits those steel plates, and it hits it hard enough, those steel plates are going to bend, break, buckle, and they're going to let water in, so all that kind of stuff. So now the Titanic's hit the iceberg. And the captain has, Richard, the character Richard, played by Clifton Webb. He's met with the captain. They've said that, hey, we're gonna start putting, people in the lifeboats, and they're starting to, stewards are now starting to go around and tell, the people like, hey, hey, we need to go start. And what they need is and basically, all the stewards are basically going around and say, hey, start putting your life belts on. No need for concern, all that kind of stuff. Because again, and it's kind of funny, the Julia, the mother there, she started asking, hey, is there any kind of danger? And they're saying, yeah, no, there is no danger on this ship. There is no danger. And they're saying that and they're saying, and he even says like they're getting put in the lifeboats, and the mom Julia's the mom is a little bit worried about it, but the lifeboats, that's one thing that they were saying is that yeah, they're just gonna put us in the lifeboats as a show, that's just it's kind of a PR move. That's actually something that they actually were thinking when they were getting put in the lifeboats, because you got to remember, in the early parts of the sinking, when like I'd say like a roughly less than an hour after the ship started to sink, or after the ship hit the iceberg, they were in those mere hours right afterwards, they were actually not a whole lot of people were super eager to get onto the lifeboats. And what a lot of people were saying is that oh, it's a PR move by the White Star Line to put them onto the boats and put them into the little water and to that kind of thing, because nobody at the time, it really took about an hour into the sinking of the ship for people to realize that holy crap, the ship is actually sinking. And I think they're showing a little bit more of a panic early on than what actually happened. They're showing a lot of people, really kind of clamoring, up the grand staircase, out onto the deck of the ship. I don't think that's exactly what happened, because you got to remember, when the ship, you got to remember, nobody was, really telling people that, hey, the ship's sinking. So a lot of people again were thinking that, yeah, there's no danger. So I mean, a lot of people were pretty um, pretty lax about it. They were staying inside and trying to stay warm because it was fairly cold out there. So there wasn't a real panic. Now I don't think the timing. They're not really explaining the whole. They're not explaining the timing of this really well, because they say that the ship essentially just hit the iceberg, and now now it seems like now it seems like they're saying that there's a lot of panic going on, and they're even starting to say that there's not enough lifeboats for everybody, so they're starting to panic. And I don't know if this is again, it's not really well done, and in portraying the passage of time and how the lifeboats were loaded and all that kind of stuff. Now, one thing that I mentioned earlier was that is that Richard, this entire time, he'd been pretty callous towards his family, and he'd been pretty callous towards his son Norman after he realized that he wasn't really his son. What actually happens now is that Richard is actually really, you actually see that Richard is actually a caring father that actually cares about his son, cares about his wife and kids, and he's actually really trying hard to get them into the lifeboats. And now what's actually happening is that he's actually forcing all of these third-class people to come up to he's basically taking all these third-class passengers and forcing them up onto the lifeboats as well. And that's one of the things it's again, the writing in this film, I don't really see the story, the progression of the story. Not a biggest fan of, because you don't get the whole sense throughout the entire film that he is because he doesn't act very well to his family, and he doesn't act in the nicest of ways. But then all of a sudden the ship starts to hit the iceberg, and then he's turns into this hero, super caring father, and after all that, all is well and all is good kind of thing. But and maybe it's trying to say that the whole life and death situation of the ship hitting the iceberg, and oh god, what is it? That all other all other problems disputes are just kind of minor now, because we're dealing with a life and death situation. It doesn't matter the quarrels that we had in the past. All that matters is that we survive, and that we tell each other that we love each other and that kind of thing. So, and then because he's acting such like a gentleman here, and he's acting like a hero, and it's something that we just weren't expecting, as earlier in the film. But it's just, again, it's just kind of interesting. So, an interesting thing that's actually happening while all this is going on is that there's a siren that's being played, kind of like a general like alarm that's being played in the background, and that's actually not really what happened at all. There was actually no like public alarm. There was no public announcing system on the Titanic, and that's kind of partially the reason why the whole lifeboat procedures, the whole lifeboat situation, kind of that's why it was so, um, you know, unorganized and disorganized as it was, because there wasn't a public announcer, there wasn't anybody going out and telling people that hey, the ship is sinking, you need to get into the lifeboats, even though there weren't even enough lifeboats for everybody. But it was such a disorganized mess how they were getting people into the lifeboats, and not enough communication on all levels, from the captain to the officers, from the officers to the other crew members. I mean, it was just a big mess, and partially contributed to the amount of people that died. The unfortunate thing about the Titanic disaster was that even if all the boats, all the seats on the lifeboats had been filled, at least 1,000 people would have still probably perished. I mean, it was such a. I mean, it again, the lack of lifeboats was a pretty damning part of the Titanic story, but again, the a lot more people could have been saved than what were saved because of the disorganization of the evacuation attempt. And this part of the film, I would say, is a well done part. Is that they're showing Richard as a father saying goodbye to his kids and all that kind of stuff, and saying goodbye to wives, and that was definitely a real sad part of the Titanic story that a lot of people that came out, especially after the ship did sink, was the fathers saying goodbye to their wives and daughters and sons, and knowing that, and a lot of the fathers knowing that hey, there aren't enough lifeboats for us, we're probably not going to see our wives again. And so again, it was a bit. So again, a real life part of the Titanic tragedy. The fathers saying goodbye to their sons and daughters, their younger sons and daughters. So, and what's actually going to happen here is another interesting part of the Titanic. Another interesting story. You did see, and there were times where you would see something like this happen. Well, actually, first off, what they're showing is they're showing able-bodied people attempting to help lower a lifeboat down, which there weren't too many instances of this happening. There was I outlined this in one of the in the A Night to Remember podcast. There was one civilian. There was one passenger that was actually allowed onto the boat because he was a yachtsman, and they realized that there weren't enough. One of the passengers realized, hey, there's not enough seamen on this boat, so we need to get another one. And then the officer was like, hey, the officer realized that hey, there's a there's a yachtsman here. Hey, get onto the boat there. So, and now what just happened here was that Norman, the young 10-year-old son, he realized he gave up his seat for a woman. And his mother realizes that he gave up his seat, and now she's really distraught about the whole thing. which that's again, it's another good story of like heroism on the night of the Titanic, because you get a nice story about how guys giving up their seats to women and all that kind of stuff, especially younger, because there are stories, I believe, of younger boys actually giving up their seats to women, so that they could have a seat on there. Now, and there may have been stories. There also are stories about kids, about men that got that actually dressed up in women's clothing in order to get seats. Of course, a lot of stories about the Titanic are that they're kind of myths, unfound stories, and that kind of thing. So, so basically, what they're showing, they actually just now showed GIF falling down. He actually fell down into the water, and he got picked up out of the water by the lifeboat, because he actually was climbing down the rope, kind of like what they showed in A Night to Remember. As I said, with that yachtsman, I think it was Arthur Godfrey Peuchen, and what they decided to do was that that he actually had to climb down the ropes in order to get to the lifeboat, and they were actually showing GIF, the character played by Robert Wagner, climbing out down the ropes in order to kind of free up the lifeboat so that it could be lowered down. And as he tried to climb up, he actually slipped and fell into the water, and thankfully the people in the water actually picked him up and put him into the lifeboat. One thing I forgot to mention, that most of the life jackets that the people are wearing are actually not truly accurate to what was actually being worn on the Titanic. There are some of the life jackets look pretty accurate, but for the most part, they're kind of inaccurate looking lifeboats. And also, what I would say is that it's pretty obvious that they're using a model to film a lot of these shots, because it looks like that they're filming it on like a giant, that they're filming the scene in like a giant tank, and because you can see like a lot of like frothy looking water in this foreground, and it looks just kind of fake and not really real. So yeah, like a lot of these scenes, it looks pretty fake, the scenes in the water and all that kind of stuff. So hey, look at that. We had what they're showing here is they're showing a man that apparently got dressed up into women's clothing. The man that dressed up in women's clothing and got onto the boat. Now, again, I said that there were stories about that. I mean, there've been myths about it. There've been reported stories about men dressing in women's clothing. I mean, there even was a deleted scene in the '97 Titanic that showcased that. I believe a lot of the stories are, I think just that, maybe stories, so to speak. But there's not a whole lot of found evidence that actually did happen. There's some people that say that that's just, those are myths, that didn't happen. There are some passenger accounts that did say that it did happen. Again, who knows? But it's all, again, part of the story. I think that'll remain forever. So. And again, one of the things that I'll say about this whole scene, this whole, montage, of the Titanic sinking and all that kind of stuff, is that it's just not, there's not a clear storyline to it. You just kind of see that, you see the different characters in different situations, like, hey, with the at least with like the '97 Titanic, you could kind of tell that there was like, you know, there was. You can kind of tell, that that the ship was sinking, that the situation was getting more dire, and there was a build up, and then the ship sinks, and then the crash actually. There hasn't really been a build up here. It's just basically been like the ship hits the iceberg, and then everything just kind of goes crazy, which, unfortunately is not actually what happened, which isn't what happened when the ship actually sank. Again, this film has been. It has been kind of, at least by Titanic historians, it's been kind of, been looked down upon as one of the more inaccurate looking movies about the Titanic. Because they basically showed, passenger panic from the moment that the ship hit the iceberg, which was not the case at all on the actual ship. In fact, some people say that there hardly even was much panic on the ship. I mean, a lot of people say that it was a bit more calmer than what actually took place. I mean, there were some instances where, officers had to fire shots in the air and had to, do a little bit of crowd control. But I mean, for the most part, a lot of people remember it being fairly calm even after all the lifeboats were, released, until the ship obviously, really doubled down and, was, it was, well known that, hey, it's going to sink now. We have no way to get off of the ship now. And what they actually just showcased here was the story of Isidore and Ida Strauss. Again, Isidore Strauss was the I think he was either an owner or one of the store runners of the Macy's Macy's department store in New York, and he was obviously in Isidore Strauss, and then his wife Ida Strauss were first class passengers on the Titanic, and Ida Strauss being a woman, women, it was women and children first on a lot of the lifeboats. They were, for the most part, for the most part, if you're a first class woman, you basically were almost guaranteed a spot in the lifeboat. I mean, there were only four documented first class women that actually died on the Titanic, and Ida Strauss was one of them, because Ida Strauss was offered a place in the lifeboat, and she declined it because of, she wanted to stay with her husband. It's like, hey, listen, we've been married for this amount of time. We're gonna we're in this together till the end. So a bit of a sad story in the mythos of Titanic. So now, what's happened? So Richard, Sturgis, he found his son Norman, and now he's trying to find a lifeboat, and basically the officer's telling him that all the lifeboats are gone now, and basically they realize that they're stuck on the ship. So. And then he goes back to the whole men wear long trousers, the grown-ups wear long trousers and all that kind of stuff. So I would say that's one thing that I do like, the little, like, Norman. I like the character of Norman. I mean, he's a bit of a hammy child actor in this movie and a bit of a hammy performance, but that's the 50s. I mean, it's just what's happening. And I really like his courage of, giving up his seat, to a woman in the lifeboat and basically going down in the ship with his father. So. And now, Richard's taking this time to basically, say how proud he is of Norman, even after all of the, shunning that has happened, as this film went on. So. So now basically we're kind of getting towards the end here. We're into the wireless room now, and basically what they're starting to realize is that they're starting to lose power, and that basically, it's not really any use, and it's not really any use in order to, transmit anymore. We basically lost all power. And this actually did happen. I mean, it did happen. They were transmitting messages well up until the end. I mean, they were transmitting messages about as late as 12:17 a.m., which, and again, the Titanic sunk underwater at about 2:20. Of course, back at, it's well documented that the messages coming from Titanic, basically from, I think, about 1:30, 1:45, basically to the end of the night, basically until the last message got sent, the power was decreasing, and as the power in the ship decreased, the message intensity, decreased as well. So a lot of the ships, were somewhat hearing the messages, but they couldn't really make out what they were saying. They were even saying, like, yeah, the message is inaudible. So again, that's kind of a bit of an accurate thing that happened. The Marconi power going out. So, and so now this is a bit of obviously a cinematic liberty taken here. They're showing basically all the people back on the ship, starting to sing the "Nearer My God to Thee" hymn. And of course, it's a well-known myth that "Near My God to Thee" was one of the last songs played on the Titanic before it sank. Of course, by the band that stayed on deck almost right up until the end to sing, or to play actually. Now, I don't think people were singing the hymn. I think it was only just played the instrumental part of it. But obviously, this obviously did not happen right before the ship, sank. I mean, every passenger left on the ship, getting, obviously, joining basically hand in hand to basically sing this hymn. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was a lot more, chaotic, and, people, running. I mean, at this point, the ship, at this point, it's not accurate how they really show the ship. At this point, the ship was, 30 degrees in the air, and most of the passengers that were still on it had scrambled back to the stern, the back part of the ship, and we're basically clinging on for dear life, and we're all scared for death at this point. So, and they're showing it a lot calmer than it would have been, and a lot kind of a lot more nicer than it really was. I mean, even James Cameron, when he was making 97 Titanic, he was basically stated that, I want this to be portrayed as the awful cataclysmic event that it truly was. And he did a good job in that. Now they're showing the Titanic in its final, final stages here. It's raising up to its giant, giant 45-degree angle, and then slowly slipping into the water. Obviously, it's a model of the ship because you don't see any people on the ship as it goes down. There's nobody on the ship. And because it's before 1985 and before the ship's wreck was discovered, the Titanic in this movie sinks intact. It sinks intact, as we well know. The Titanic broke apart, before it, sank underneath the water. However, in basically every single movie that was made before the Titanic wreck was discovered in '85 by Robert Ballard, every single movie showcases the Titanic sinking in one piece because, that was basically the generally held belief at the time, was that it did sink intact. So, and that is basically where the movie ends, actually. It basically ends at the Titanic sinks, and it's like, yep, the Titanic sinks. Goodbye. It's end. So, yeah. So that is 1953's Titanic. As you can tell, again, it's not really my favorite of the Titanic movies. However, it's an interesting history to it, and an interesting catalog in the Titanic repertoire, so to speak. This, I believe, was actually, I think this actually was the first major studio-produced American talkie film about the Titanic. There were a couple silent films about the Titanic, but I think it was the first major studio film produced in America about the Titanic. And for a while, it was literally this movie, and then A Night to Remember came out only about 5 years after this. And again, I did A Night to Remember, the 1958 Titanic movie. I did that back in August. So definitely, if you enjoyed this podcast about the Titanic, definitely go back and watch that one. A Night to Remember is a better movie, and B, there's a lot more like historical content about the Titanic in that film. So I definitely recommend checking that out. But again, this is an interesting, an interesting catalog in the Titanic movies repertoire. And this movie actually helped the production of A Night to Remember, because there was actually an interesting trivia tidbit that I had read, is that Walter Lord, when he was writing A Night to Remember, he actually was able to use his contacts through 20th Century Fox in order to get in touch with some of the Titanic survivors. Actually, some of the Titanic survivors there were private screenings held of this movie for Titanic survivors, and the descriptions are that they were pretty rough. It was pretty emotionally, a lot of emotions going on, and you can obviously imagine. I mean, it was a lot of those survivors. It was definitely something emotional to see that happen again on the big screen. So, but because 20th Century Fox had gotten in contact with all these Titanic survivors, Walter Lord, who was starting to write his book about the Titanic, he was able to use his contacts in order to get in touch with survivors, and then he used those survivors in order to write the book A Night to Remember, which was released in 1955, which then in turn became the 1958 film A Night to Remember, which I did. So again, closing thoughts on 1953's Titanic. Not the best, but in my experience watching a lot of Titanic movies and kind of like films that like attempt to dramatize the Titanic, I mean, the only ones to me that really even hold a candle are essentially A Night to Remember and James Cameron's Titanic. And other than that, I mean, they're not really good attempts. I mean, those two are I think by far the best. This one's a pretty solid attempt. I mean, it's an okay story. I mean, there's some plot holes or some kind of inconsistencies that I look at, but for the most part, not a bad movie. So, I mean, and again, if anybody is a Titanic fan, anybody self-proclaimed Titanic history buffs out there, and if you haven't seen the 1953 Titanic, I definitely recommend it to those people. So, because if only for the fact that it's a movie about the Titanic and it gives you another view of the disaster, so to speak. So. All right, so that is that. That's the 1953 Titanic, produced by 20th Century Fox, starring, again, Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck, Robert Wagner, Audrey Dalton, and a whole bunch of other actors and actresses. That is, I can't talk, my bad. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Again, thank you guys so much for listening to this commentary and to this podcast. We'll have more episodes coming out. In fact, I believe for the month of April, not only am I going to do the 1953 Titanic, I'm also going to do the 97 Titanic as well. And hopefully I'll actually have a little bit more to talk about in that movie as well, because that one actually has a pretty interesting, not only does it, I think, tell the story of Titanic pretty well, but I think it also has a really interesting production history. So this 1953 Titanic's probably going to come out first, and then we'll do the 1997 Titanic as well. Thank you guys so much for listening. Make sure check out other episodes of the Movie Commentary Podcast on anywhere you get your podcasts at. make sure you guys are good to one another out there. Stay golden out there, everybody, and I will see you on the flip side.